Hi, everyone. I'm George Hanlon. I'm Director of Grants at Indiana Humanities. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We are going to be talking to you today about Indiana Humanities and our grants that we're offering in 2022. The goals of today's webinar is to give you an overview of Indiana Humanities, what we do as an organization, so you get an understanding of the sort of work that we support. And then again, we are going to be talking to you about the different grants that we offer in 2022. Now, I will say this, that if you're familiar with Indiana Humanities and you've applied for our grants or you're familiar with our grants, this is probably not going to be quite as meaningful to you. You can just listen from the background while you do chores at your house or your office or wherever you may be, and you'll get the gist of it if you're already familiar with the programs that we offer through our grants. But if you're not familiar with Indiana Humanities or you've not applied for our grants, then I think this will be especially meaningful for you, and we hope that you get a lot out of it. As I go through the slides, I'm going to turn off my video so you can just see the slide presentation itself. I will tell you this, if you have questions throughout the webinar, type those into chat. My colleague Megan is also on the webinar. She'll monitor the chat and she will pipe in from time to time with questions. Another option is just to save the questions at the end, type them into chat, and then we can talk through them at the end of the webinar. We scheduled the webinar to run until 11 o'clock, so I will do my best to get through a lot of this information and provide you with what you need in order to apply successfully for one of our grants. So I'm going to turn off the video now, but know that, of course, we're here monitoring the chat, and I see that some of you are saying hi, and we're so glad to have you along. All right. The first thing that I want to talk about today to all of you is a little bit about Indiana Humanities, so you have an overview of our organization and know a little bit about us. I always say to grant seekers, whether you're applying for a grant from Indiana Humanities or whether you are applying for another grant through another organization, it's always helpful to know about the person or the organization making the grant. So you understand what's important to them, you understand their mission, the sort of things that they like to fund, and you can align your request to match the mission and the goals and the values of that organization that's making the grant. So with that in mind, if you're not familiar with Indiana Humanities, I think this is a great time to tell you about our organization. We at Indiana Humanities are a statewide organization. Our goal is to promote the public humanities across the state of Indiana. We like to use the humanities as a tool to connect Hoosiers, to open minds, to enrich their lives. We especially like to facilitate and develop and facilitate programs that encourage Hoosiers to think, to read, and to talk. And that is the core of our mission, is to encourage Hoosiers to think, to read, and to talk. We provide a space both physically and digitally for people to connect and to converse. We are headquartered in Indianapolis on Delaware Street in a historic home that used to belong to an author named Meredith Nicholson. But our goal is to get programming across the state. So we work really hard to make sure that we're getting humanities programming in your communities. Of course, with the pandemic, we, like most of you, have turned increasingly to online programs. And there have been some downsides to that, but it's been in many cases a wonderful opportunity to learn about ways that we can use technology to get across the state. So we both provide physical and digital programs for people. We've been doing our work for a long time now, for almost 50 years. This year in September, we celebrate our 50th anniversary of the founding of Indiana Humanities. I mentioned that we are a nonprofit, but we're a partner to a federal agency, the National Endowment for the Humanities. The National Endowment for the Humanities is, as I mentioned, a federal agency. It receives your taxpayer dollars. Its goal is to promote the humanities across the nation. It provides us with an annual grant. We apply each year for some money from the National Endowment for the Humanities. We take that it's several $100,000 that we take, and we use that for our operations, for our programs, and most of the grants that we provide are funded through this annual grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. So most of the funding that we give out is federal dollars. There are some strings attached, and we'll talk a little bit about that coming up. We are one of 56 councils across the nation. The NEH has a partner council in all 50 states and 6 territories. So we're just one of a number of agencies, nonprofits across the country that are doing the work in the humanities in the states and territories. Now, because I'm a little bit of a history buff, I will talk a bit about the founding of the National Endowment for the Humanities and some of the founding principles that went into creating the National Endowment for the Humanities, because I think that's kind of enlightening. I won't spend a lot of time with this. I'll try to breeze through it, but I do think that some of these points are illuminating to the work that we do. The National Endowment for the Humanities and its sister organization, the National Endowment for the Arts, were created back in 1965. Congress passed legislation and Lyndon Johnson signed into law a bill in 1965 that created both the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. At that time, of course, America was in a Cold War. We were battling the Soviet Union for supremacy across the globe, duking it out whether the Soviet Union's model of communism would thrive, or whether the American ideals of individual rights and democracy would prevail. We were, of course, investing a lot in science and technology. We were carrying out the Cold War via the military and in investments in science and technology. And of course, that's where NASA comes into the picture. But the artists and the people that were working in the humanities in the 50s and 60s said, if we are going to thrive, if our nation is going to survive, if we're going to win this Cold War, we also have to invest in the arts and the humanities and culture, because we need an educated public to continue this legacy of democracy. Congress bought into that argument, and again, they passed the legislation. In the founding legislation has some interesting ideas in it, and I'll go through a few of those now. And again, I think these are illuminating to the work that Indiana Humanities does. First of all, the legislation that Congress passed in 1965 said that the arts and the humanities belong to all the people of the United States, and we take that very seriously here at Indiana Humanities, that the humanities belong to all Hoosiers. So we work very hard to get across the state. The legislation in 1965 said that advanced civilizations cannot limit its efforts just to science and technology. So there's that whole idea of if we're going to advance, we can't just win this Cold War by science and technology alone, but we've got to give full value and support to other branches of scholarship, so that we better understand our past, we can better analyze the current times, and that we have a better view of the future. It just amazes me how prescient some of this language was in this founding legislation. Democracy demands wisdom and vision in its citizen. So we have to have access to the arts and the humanities. This, I think, the last point in this third bullet that we're going through here is interesting. We have to be masters of our technology and not its unthinking servant. And how important is that to think about today when technology has taken over so much of our lives? And finally, the arts and humanities help us celebrate the United States' rich cultural heritage. It helps to promote mutual respect for the diverse beliefs and values of all persons and groups. And again, in 2022, when we are so divided, how important are the arts and humanities to bring us together as a country, as a community, to work through difficult problems? So I liked sharing those founding principles because I do think that they're very important to help illustrate the work that we are trying to do here at Indiana Humanities. So the National Endowment for the Humanities, after it was founded, for the first 6 or 7 years, was primarily operating out of Washington. And in the early 1970s, it decided it needed to do a better job of getting the humanities out to the states. And that's when it started to create this network of state and territorial councils. I will point out that the National Endowment for the Arts did the same thing, but differently. Whereas the National Endowment for the Humanities created a network of nonprofits, the National Endowment for the Arts created a network of state government agencies. So here in Indiana, we have the Indiana Arts Commission, which is the NEA's counterpart in Indiana. They are a state agency and get state funding. So as you think about grants for cultural programming, you'll want to keep the Indiana Arts Commission in mind, because they're a significant funder of programs, but know that they focus on the arts and that they're a state agency and they do bring to the table state dollars. We here at Indiana Humanities, as I mentioned, are a nonprofit. We do not get state dollars, but we do go out and we raise our additional support on our own via corporate sponsorships and foundation support and individual donations and things like that. But we do rely very heavily on that operating support and that annual grant that we get from the National Endowment for the Humanities to provide programming and grant support. And so we collaborate very closely with the NEH. At this point, I want to talk a little bit about the humanities, because we have been talking a lot already about the arts and the humanities. And if you're like me, you may be wondering, what exactly do we mean by the humanities? We hear about the arts an awful lot. I think most of us understand what the arts are, but if I were to ask any one of you on this webinar what the humanities are, we'd be all over the place with our responses, and I'm sure many of you would be doubtful about what exactly that entails. So what we do is we go by the definition that the National Endowment for the Humanities provides us and provides to the public on its website, what the humanities are. And you'll see on this slide, I have them listed. The two big groups that we tend to work with a lot are history and literature. We do a lot of work with historical societies and historical museums and libraries and in the areas of history and literature, but the humanities are much more broad. They also encompass the study of languages, philosophy, archaeology, jurisprudence, which is the history of law, the study of law, comparative religion, and ethics. We don't support the arts. We don't support just the creation of art, the display of art, the performance of art. But the National Endowment for the Humanities does consider the theory, the history, and the criticism of the arts to fall into humanities categories. So if you put the art into context, then that is a humanities topic. And as an example, I will point out, if you're a civic theater and you want to do, for example, a production of A Raisin in the Sun, the classic 1950s play by Lorraine Hansberry. We are not going to pay for the staging of that play. We're not going to help you, with the lighting, technology, with, paying the actors or the costuming or anything like that. But if you're a civic theater and you're putting on the production of the play, and after the play, you want to bring in a literary scholar to talk about the themes of the play, putting the play in its historical context of the civil rights era and the role that it played in advancing civil rights, and put the context around it, that sort of thing we could potentially fund. Another thing that I want to point out is the social sciences are not humanities. Political science and public policy and things like that are technically humanities topics. They don't fall into these categories and these bullets over on the first and second column, but if you use what we call humanistic approaches to study social sciences, that falls into the realm of the type of work we support. For example, immigration is obviously a hot topic right now. Immigration in and of itself is not a humanities topic. It's not, literature or history or archaeology. There may be some components involved, but the broad topic of immigration is really more of a public policy issue, a social science. But if you want to use the humanities to understand immigration issues, that is an activity that we can fund. For example, if you're a historical society and you want to look at issues of immigration through the lens of the history of immigration in your community and do an exhibit or an author talk or something like that, we can support that activity. Or if you're a library and you want to explore themes or issues of immigration around a novel that really illustrates the topic well, and you want to buy copies of the book and distribute it in your community and have some reading and discussion programs, that is an approach using what we call humanistic methods or humanistic content, and we can support non-humanities topics through those means. So I know this is a really tricky concept to grasp some of the time, what the humanities are. So I will just say, if you have questions about it at any time, always reach out to us. We are glad to consult with you as you're preparing your grant application. I don't know, I have the chat popped up. I don't see questions right now, but if there are questions, we'll take a pause here and you can pop it in the chat and I can try to answer it. And if not, then we'll talk about the ways that Indiana Humanities provides the humanities programming across the state of Indiana. Okay, well, let's proceed then with that topic. And again, if you have questions at any time, just pop them in chat and we'll take periodic pauses, or we will answer the questions at the end of the session. So, as I mentioned, Indiana Humanities' goal is to provide humanities programming across the entire state of Indiana. And there are two big ways that we do that. One way is by developing and implementing our own programs that we put on across the state. That's the one big bucket. The other big bucket is by providing grants to people like you to develop your own program and put them on across the state. That second bucket is the focus of our conversation here for most of this webinar. But I do want to spend a few minutes here talking about that first bucket, our own programs, because while it's not, they're not official grant opportunities within that programming bucket, we often do provide stipends and speakers bureaus and things like that. So I think it will be helpful for you to understand the programs that we put on ourselves and how you may still benefit from them without actually applying for an official grant. So let's look at that first bucket, programs. We have a programming team of about 5 people here that, as I mentioned, design and implement and put on our own programs across the state, and they take a variety of formats. Usually our programs, the bulk of our programs, we package into thematic topics that last 2 to 3 years. And most of the programs during that 2 to 3 year window will tie into that programming theme. For example, some of you who've followed Indiana Humanities for a time may remember that the last few years, we've been looking at urban and rural divides across the state. What issues are rural America dealing with? What are the issues that urban Indiana's dealing with? How are they alike? How are they dissimilar? You know, we're in a divided time. How do we bridge that? So all of our program looked at that. The year before that, I think it was looking at the intersection of the sciences and the humanities. And we did a lot of programming around the novel Frankenstein during those 2 years. Frankenstein had just turned 200 years old as a novel, and we did a lot of community reads and a lot of festivals around Frankenstein looking at those themes. The theme that we're currently in 2020, 2021, and 2022, I think those are the years, that may be 2021, 2022, 2023. Megan could chat and put that in chat and clarify that. But the current theme is called Unearth, and it's looking at the environment through a humanities lens. So all of our programming, not all, but most of the programming that we at Indiana Humanities are going to do over the next couple of years are going to center on environmental themes. It looks like Megan has put in the chat a link to learn more about the program. So, you know, this is going to include things like we're circulating around the state an exhibit produced by the Smithsonian called Waterways. It's currently in Madison, Indiana right now, that's looking at the impact of water and the role water plays in our society. We're doing a speakers bureau where we have scholars that are combining talks related to the environment and including humanistic methods or humanities topics. It's a speakers bureau that organizations across the state can tap into and have a speaker come and talk in their communities. That speakers bureau, I believe, is still open. So if you're looking for a speaker at your organization, I would encourage you to visit indianahumanities.org, go to our programs page and look at the Unearthed Speakers Bureau, and we can potentially send a speaker to you. We're doing a series of films. We've hired some filmmakers to use the humanities to explore environmental themes. And I think I've seen some of the films, quite beautiful pieces, that we're going to do a film tour. We're also doing a statewide read of a book called World of Wonders by a woman named Amy Nezhukumatatil, I think is how you pronounce her last name. We have provided books to organizations all across the state. We are providing some stipends to do some community conversations, some community reads, some additional programming. So that's another way that we are celebrating the Unearthed theme. I will say that I believe the community read applications are closed now, but this is something we offer regularly. And again, it's a good example of how you can get some support from Indiana Humanities that's not officially through our grants program. So always keep that in mind. Of course, another program that's been super popular is our Campfires program, where we take people across the state to natural areas, to state parks and nature preserves, and we'll take them on hikes and kayak trips, and we'll have a scholar choose some readings associated with the site that relate to nature, and we'll read and discuss, and at the end, we often gather around a campfire, have hot dogs, have beer, and talk about what we've read. So some examples of the programming that we're doing through the Unearthed theme. Other popular programs are Novel Conversations program. This is our longest running program here at Indiana Humanities. It is basically a program where we lend books to book clubs across the state. If you have a book club in your part of the state and you need books, you can register for the Novel Conversations program. You go online, you see that we have about 800 titles, 800 different titles, and within those 800 titles, we have about 10 to 15 copies of each book. So if you got a book club and you're wanting to read a particular book, you just go, you order however many copies you want. We'll send it to you free through interlibrary loan, and you can go to your local library, pick it up, distribute it to your club members, read it, discuss it, send the books back, and get another book to read. So that's a fantastic program and a great way for us to get reading and discussion programs across the state. And the last program that we put on that I'll highlight for now, because we do want to go into our grants, but the last program I'll highlight is the Indiana Authors Awards. This is a program that we manage with support from Glick Philanthropies. And basically every 2 years, we open up a competition, an awards program for the best books in Indiana. We just closed the nominations for 2022. I think we got like 250, 260 nominations, and we are going to send those out to judging panels and award prizes for the best fiction book, the best nonfiction book, best children's book, best poetry book, and there are other categories as well. We will announce those awards later this year. And then one of the great aspects of this program is we have these authors that win the awards go around the state to give talks. So if you're a library or a historical society, you'll want to check out the Indiana Authors Awards website, especially once the new authors are announced, the new winning authors, and the chances are good that those authors in 2023 and 2024 will be touring the state, and we can send those to your organization. So just another way that Indiana Humanities can support you through our programming department. Now, we're here, of course, to talk about grants, and we have about a little over half hour left. So I want to spend the rest of the time talking about that second big bucket of work that we do at Indiana Humanities, and that's our grants program. As I mentioned, we are here to serve the entire state. We work with 6.8 million Hoosiers. Our staff of 12 people cannot be everywhere at the state at all times. We do a wonderful job of getting our programs across the state, but we depend on people like you, organizations like yours, to help us with programming, and that's where our grants come in mind. We put together a grants program with a number of options for you to look at, come up with ideas for programming, apply for funds. We'll fund you. You can carry the work out in your communities. That's the premise of the grants program. We always are looking at our grants program and what's effective and what's not, and reshaping it. I will say for 2022, the grants look very similar to what we offered in 2021 and the year before. We did a fairly significant overhaul of our grants program in 2019, and we're not changing it a lot, which is why I say, if you're familiar with our grants program, this is all going to sound pretty familiar to you. If you're not familiar, though, this is, I think, a good overview. And I will emphasize the fact that this is an overview of our grants. We don't have the time today to dig into every single grant in a whole lot of detail, but I will at least give you an overview of what each of the grants is about. I'll give you an example of a program that we funded with that grant, so you have an idea. And again, throughout this webinar, I want to encourage you to always reach out to us if you have ideas that you want to talk about. We are glad to provide that one-on-one support that you need. So the overall goals of our grants program I have spelled out on this slide. First of all, we want to provide the sort of grants that allow you and your partners across the state to have quality public access humanities programming. We want your community to benefit from the humanities in the ways that we spelled out under those founding principles of the NEH, right? There are so many wonderful benefits to engaging in the humanities, and we want to make sure that your communities have that opportunity. When we design the grant program, we want to make sure that there are a variety of grant opportunities to meet your needs. We also want to provide grants with flexibility so you can do some creative, meaningful, and impactful work. And so for the next half hour or so, I'm going to dig in, as I mentioned, and talk about the 5 core grants that we're going to offer. And then there are some other grants as well that I will highlight at the end of the session. We'll go ahead and talk about each of those grants, but before I do that, I do want to point out across the board, there are some general grant requirements that every one of our grants, nearly every one of our grants, there may be some exceptions, there are always exceptions, but nearly every one of our grants that we offer, all 5 core grants at least, have these main requirements. So let's go over those. First of all, in order to apply for an Indiana Humanities grant, you have to be a tax-exempt organization. You don't necessarily need to be a 501c3, but you do need to be classified as tax-exempt. That means that maybe the IRS has determined that you're a 501c3, maybe the state of Indiana recognizes you as a religious organization or a school, but you do have to be tax-exempt. You cannot get a grant from us, again, most of our grants, you cannot get from us if you are an individual or if you're a for-profit organization. That's important to know, that you've got to be a tax-exempt organization. If you're an individual in this webinar and you have an idea for a really great program, oh, I'd like to do maybe this oral history project, we unfortunately cannot give you as an individual a grant to do that. You've got to find a nonprofit partner to be the official applicant, and you have to apply under the auspices of that group. That group then will get the fund, they will manage the program, and you can work with them to get paid a stipend and things like that. But know that the applicants have to be tax exempt. The grants have to go towards programming. We do not provide funds for operating support, usually. Now, with CARES and with the American Rescue Plan for pandemic relief, the NEH did give us money for some operating support grants, but that is usually not the case. And as far as I know, we are not going to get any more pandemic relief money in 2022. So all of our grants in 2022 will be for humanities programming, which means that you've got to come up with an idea, say, I want to put on this program, this exhibit, or this workshop, or this author talk, and I need to prepare a budget for it, and I want Indiana Humanities to help pay for it. You've got to come up with a program. And of course, the program has to focus on the humanities, those topics that we talked about a few slides ago, history and literature and archaeology and philosophy and ethics and things like that. Again, if you're not sure whether your program falls into the realm of the humanities, reach out to us. This third bullet on this slide is a little bit of a sticking point for people. We do require you to have a humanities scholar involved in the planning and or the implementation of your program. Again, most of these funds that we give out for grants come from the National Endowment for the Humanities. They want to protect your taxpayer dollars. They want to make sure that the money that we give out for grants for programs across the state are for legitimate, bona fide, well-planned, well-thought-out, accurate programs. So, you know, if you're going to do an exhibit on the Native American history in your community, we don't want you just making it up based on myths or your understanding of Native American history. We really want you, first of all, it would be great to involve tribal leaders or people, you know, who are indigenous involved in the planning, but we also would love for you to have a scholar from a nearby university to help you, you know, guide the topics, to review the text that you develop and things like that. I know that this is a barrier. I know this, it sounds challenging, especially if you're from a small rural community where I grew up and there's not a college or a university nearby. This can seem like an obstacle. We don't want it to be. If you're developing a program and you need to have a scholar involved and you don't know who that might be, reach out to us and we can help you find somebody. I will point out that the scholar does not have to be the person delivering the program. It can be more in the background as an advisory role. So keep that in mind, but do let us know if you have a question. But that is a requirement that the NEH mandates, and so we do our best to comply with their wishes with that. Finally, the last point that I'll make about the general grant requirement is that any programming that we fund has to be for a public audience, and it should be presented in an area or in a place that's ADA accessible so that everybody can benefit from this. Again, these are taxpayer dollars. We want to make sure that everybody in your community has the opportunity to attend your program. That does not mean that you can't target it. You can definitely design a program and sort of promote it to a key audience in mind, but you really should make sure that everybody has access to it. We often get a question at this point, can I charge money? Can I charge admission to my program? And you can, as long as that admission is reasonable, and it's not going to prohibit too many people from attending. We often say, think about the price of a movie ticket in your community, what that costs. If it's much more than the price of a movie ticket, we're probably not going to fund it. There was a great program that we received an application for several years ago that was a tour of underground railroad sites across the state. And they had scholars involved, and it was going to be great, but it was also going to cost $60 a person. And we didn't feel like that was that was accessible. We thought that fee was too high. So you can charge admission, but keep it around the price of a movie ticket. Also, I will point out that we do consider school audiences to be public audiences. So if you're a teacher and you want to bring in an author and do some curriculum development around a book, you don't need to open up that program to the public at large. You can focus on your students and delivering the program to students, and that we consider that to be a public audience. And in a similar manner, if you're working in a prison and you want to bring in some sort of humanities program into the facility, we consider incarcerated people to be a public audience, and obviously it's challenging to get the public into that facility. So as long as you're providing it to incarcerated people, we do consider that to be a public audience as well. Okay, let's dig in now to the 5 core grants that we are going to offer at Indiana Humanities in 2022. The first grant that I'll highlight is our Action Grant. This is our most popular grant because really, in many ways, it's our most accessible grant. It offers up to $3,000, and this grant can be used for really any type of humanities program across the spectrum. All of the topics, history, literature, philosophy, comparative religion, you name it. If it's a humanities topic, this grant will support it. Other grants are very specific in what they support and don't support, but this Action Grant will support across the board, really any humanities program or programs that use humanistic methods. This grant we offer around the clock, and that's another reason it's so popular. We review grant applications and award them every month. And the way that works is this. Well, for example, we're coming up on the 1st of February. On February 1, I'm going to open up our grants portal and download all of the applications that came in during the month of January for the Action Grant. And I'm going to distribute it to our reviewers, and probably about the 3rd week of February, we're going to get together and evaluate them using our scoring rubric and decide which to award. We do that every single month. So if you apply on January 1, you may have to wait 7 or 8 weeks to hear whether you got the grant, but if you apply towards the end of January, it may be 3 to 4 weeks. So we are doing it regularly, and that just makes it easier to apply for. Some of our other grants we offer only once or twice a year. With this grant, you can apply whenever you're ready. I do encourage you to apply with enough time between your request and when you want to do the program, so we have full time to consider it, and so you may have the opportunity to revise it if you're not awarded a grant. The beautiful thing about the Action Grant is if you allow yourself enough time, you don't get the grant, I can come back to you and say, hey, we didn't award the grant to you. These are some of the reasons why. Can you go back, adapt your application, resubmit it? If you've allowed enough time to do that, that's great. If you say, or if you're right now wanting to do a program in April and you're getting an application ready to submit in February, that's not going to leave you very much time to do that. So just keep that in mind. They are very responsive grants, but if you're able to plan far enough in advance, you might have a couple of opportunities to apply for the grant and get it if you're rejected that first time. I will talk now about match. We do require some type of match for most of our grants, and you'll see here on this slide that we require 100% match for our Action Grants. And you may be wondering, what does that mean? Well, what that means is if we give you a grant, we are going to obviously send you some money, financial resources. We want you to bring to the table your own resources as well. Different grants have different matches. In the case of the Action Grant, it requires 100% match. So if we give you a $3,000 grant, we want you to bring to the table an equal amount, $3,000 of your own resources. That could be cash that you're spending on the project. Let's say that you're going to do an exhibit and it's going to cost you $4,500 to develop and manufacture the exhibit and install it. You may ask for a grant from us to cover $3,000 of the cost. You may bring $1,500 of your own cash that you have on hand to the table, and that will get you part of your match. It doesn't have to be cash. You may not have any cash. It could be that the exhibit's only $3,000. You still need to find that 100% match. So even if you bring the $1,500, you still got $1,500 to make up, right? The nice thing about our match is you can count the value of your staff time. You can count the value of volunteer time. You can count the value of in-kind services. If you have a printer that donates printing to you, you can count the value of that. So it's really, for these small grants, not hard to make a match. So for example, let's go back to the example of the exhibit. If you ask us for $3,000 for an exhibit, and that's what it's going to cost you, and you're not bringing your own cash to the table, you can say, okay, well, our program manager is probably going to spend $100 hours on this program, and her hourly rate is $20 an hour. So 100 times $20 an hour, that's $2,000 that you're paying her in salary that you're bringing to the table. There's $2,000 of your match, right? If you have volunteers that are donating time, you can budget for the value of their time and count that towards your match as well. So it can be a blend of cash that you bring to the table. Again, a blend of the value of your staff time, of volunteer time. If the printer says, hey, you know what, I'm going to print flyers to promote this. Normally I would charge you $200. I'm only charging you $100. You can count that $100 to your match. We will see what a budget form looks like here in a little bit. You will spell that all out on your budget that you submit to us, to Indiana Humanities. It's going to spell out how you're going to spend your grant dollars if you get the award, and then how you're going to make your match. And it'll make sense, I think, once you see that form. And I'm able to see the staff volunteer question right now. First of all, is there an accepted average hourly rate for volunteers? No, we do not provide guidance on that. What we tell people is, be realistic on your budget, what you would pay for that service. So, if you're using volunteers to take tickets, and let's say you're using one volunteer to take tickets, and that person's going to spend 4 hours, a ticket taker, you might pay $15 an hour. And so maybe for 4 hours, maybe that's $60. If you budgeted those four hours at, say, like $100 an hour for that volunteer, and really you would pay someone $100 to take tickets? No, make it a reasonable rate for what the job does. Now, if you're using a scholar from the local university, and that person is donating her time, and she's donating 20 hours, and she says, hey, I'm just giving it to you, and you want to count that as your in-kind, you may ask, what would you normally charge for this? Someone who's a professor is obviously going to have a much higher hourly rate. So I would say maybe a combination, just determine internally what you would pay someone to do that job, or ask the person that's providing the service, what would you charge for this? But make sure it's reasonable. And then how do you approve staff or volunteer time? What we do is, if you get a grant, we have an in-kind form that we have, you should ask that volunteer to complete. So, if Jane Doe gives 10 hours, she would fill out the form. I, Jane Doe, donated 10 hours at $15 an hour, that's $150, and she signs it. You keep that form in your files. We actually don't ask for any receipts when it comes, if you get a grant from us and you get an award, and when it's time to report back to us, we do not actually ask you for receipts. You have to send in a final expenditure form telling us how you use the grant dollars and how you met your match, but you don't send us receipts. You don't send us those in-kind forms. You just keep them in your file for 3 years. So that's how you prove it. Now, we get audited every year. It's an intense audit. The auditors have never asked us to go to grant recipients and and have them submit the proof, the receipts, the in-kind forms that they have signed. So that's never happened, but it theoretically could. So I always tell people, when you get a grant from us, follow our project director guidelines, save your receipts, get your volunteers to sign your in-kind forms. That's how you prove it. All right, so that's the action grant. Let's go ahead and talk about the next grant. I'm supposed to give you an example. So here's very quickly, because I'm talking a lot, I will run through this example very quickly. An organization that received an action grant is Historic New Harmony. If you've not been to New Harmony, Indiana, you should go. It is down in Southwest Indiana by Evansville along the Wabash River. It was the site of 2 utopian communities in the 1800s. The University of Southern Indiana has a program there that celebrates the town's history. Wonderful people that are putting on great stuff. They get every once in a while a grant from us to do something called Heritage Artisans Days. They bring in reenactors to demonstrate old crafts, old trades. They have scholars there that kind of help put it in context. They bring in thousands of school children in April to come to New Harmony and see these demonstrations and learn these crafts, these skills, and learn about the history of New Harmony through these people that are demonstrating these skills. So that's one that we've given grants to over the years. And I think a good example of the action grant in action. So the next grant I want to highlight is our Historic Preservation Education Grant. This is a grant that we give out with funds from Indiana Landmarks, the state preservation organization, a wonderful statewide partner. They provide half the funds for this grant. So in this case, this is a grant that is funded with National Endowment for the Humanities funds, our part, but then also private dollars through Indiana Landmarks. The goal of this grant is to support educational programs related to historic structures and to tell the history of those structures, to encourage the preservation of those structures, to foster a value and understanding and belief in the historic preservation movement. So this is not, I should say, about bricks and mortar. If you have an old structure in your town that needs to be preserved, this is not about helping to pay for repairs and renovations. This is rather to educate people about that historic structure. Now, a couple of points I want to make. Historic structures is a broad term. It could be a building. It could be a historic roadway like the National Road or the Lincoln Highway. It could be historic landscaping, landscape architecture. Structure is pretty broad. Most of the things we fund center on buildings, but some on roads. This can take many forms. It can be workshops. It could be author talks. It could be lectures. Oftentimes with this grant, we will fund walking tours of historic downtown districts. They used to be a lot on paper, but more and more people are doing apps for the walking tours. But the idea is to foster an appreciation for the historic structures in your community. This match requires, again, this grant requires 100% match. So if you ask for $2,500, you need to demonstrate that you're bringing $2,500 of your own resources to the table. And this is a grant that we give out twice a year with a deadline coming up on February 28th. And then a second deadline will be on September 30. An example of a program that we funded with this grant, St. Mary of the Woods College, which is a campus in West Terre Haute, Indiana. If you have never been to St. Mary of the Woods, you should definitely visit sometime, do a drive-through, stop, walk through. They have a gorgeous campus. Most of the buildings on campus were designed in the 1800s, early 1900s by a family of architects, 4th-generation of the architects named the Bolins, who are headquartered here in Indianapolis. They used the HPEG, as it's called, to hire a scholar named Jim Glass, who's the preeminent preservation scholar in the state, to do research on the buildings, to do a couple of presentations on the buildings. One of the talks he gave here at Indiana Landmarks in Indianapolis. The other was on site at the campus in October, I think back in 2019. And then after his talk, they did a tour, a walking tour with a tour guide of the campus. And you can see here in the photo, one of the guides in, I forget which building this is, a little chapel on campus, but just stunning architecture. So this is a really good example of an organization that used the HPEG very well for a fantastic project. The third grant I'll highlight is the Incommon Grant. This is a grant that we often give out in conjunction with the Central Indiana Community Foundation, which is Indianapolis, Marion County's community foundation. They support a lot of the projects with this grant in Marion County. We use our Indiana Humanities funds to support projects across the state with the Incommon Grant, so it's a partnership. This grant offers up to $5,000, and the goal of this grant is to use the humanities to explore issues of race and ethnicity and how race and ethnicity continue to have an impact in society today. We first gave this grant back in 2017. It has been incredibly popular, and a variety of groups have used it to explore, how race continues to divide us, how society still fosters inequities based on race and ethnicity and things like that. We really love giving this grant for conversational programs, dialogues, and conversations. So keep that in mind. This is grant, as I mentioned, it's up to $5,000. We require only a 50% match for this grant. So if you ask for the full $5,000 for this grant, you have to bring to the table only $2,500 of your own resource. And this is a grant that we also give out twice a year. Again, deadline on February 28th, and the second round of this grant will be due on August 31st. Now, let's show you an example of this grant to kind of illustrate what we're talking about. Here in this picture, you'll see a group that's being led by an organization called the House Life Project. They did a program called People Plus Property. This was back in 2017 when we first offered the grant, and it's a really good illustration of what we want the grant to do. The People Plus Property Project brought together, as you can see, a group of diverse neighbors. They gathered at this abandoned house on the Near East Side of Indianapolis for 6 times over the course of a couple of months during the summer of I think when they executed it was probably summer of 2018. And they gathered 6 times, and each of the sessions they had a scholar or an expert talk about housing issues and the history of housing in Indianapolis, and how housing has not always been equitable in Indianapolis, and how there has been segregation and discrimination in housing. And so they did these community conversations. They also at each of the conversations brought a writer to produce an essay based on the talks. They had artists on hand to do some drawings. And again, we don't support art, but art can be a component of a broader humanities topic. And we really liked how they had artists involved. At the end, after these conversations, they developed an exhibit with some of the essays, some of the artwork. They invited the community to attend. They continued the conversations. They produced a little zine. And it was a fascinating and really creative way to get people in the neighborhood to talk about how housing has not always been housing has not always been equitable, and how it often remains inequitable in Indianapolis. So that's an example of an Incommon program. Now, the final 2 grants I'll highlight as part of our core grants are larger grants. The first one I'll highlight is the Innovation Grant. This grant offers up to $10,000 for, as the name suggests, innovative work. You have to, as the grant applicant, explain to us why the grant is innovative. Maybe it is a program that you've just never seen anybody do before in the field of the humanities. It's just really unique. Maybe others have done it, but maybe it's using some different approaches that you've never tried before in your community, so it's a stretch for you. Or maybe it's using technology in new ways to deliver humanities program. You have to, as the applicant, explain to us why it's innovative and make the case. This offers, as you can see, up to $10,000, so it is, again, a bigger grant. We offer this grant only once a year, and what we require with this grant, because it is a bit bigger, because it's a really competitive grant, you have to submit by April 30th an online form to us explaining your idea. And what happens after that is the staff takes the form, we review all of the ideas. If we think that your idea has potential merit, we'll invite you to submit a full application that's due by July 31st. If we don't think it really aligns with what we're thinking with the Innovation Grant, we'll say, hey, thanks, not quite to the level that we're thinking, but maybe it's good for an action grant or something like that. This grant requires a 50% match. So if you ask for the $10,000, you've got to bring at least 5,000 to the table. An example of the innovation grant, we started giving this grant out in 2018, and I will say that the pandemic has impacted some of our grant programs. Obviously, people have had to shift. This is a grant that had to sort of shift its focus a bit, but I still think they did some really creative stuff. The Hoosier Young Farmers Coalition got a $10,000 grant for us to explore farming in the 21st century. And what they were going to do was to do sort of like what we do with our campfires program, bring people onto 21st century farms and do tours and read literature and talk to farmers that are farming and use sort of like a StoryCorps recording booth to record stories of farming today and share those out. Because of the pandemic, that didn't quite play out the way that they expected, but they did still do a lot of storytelling. They did podcasts about 21st century farmers. The whole premise is that farming in Indiana in the 21st century is not like you might think of farming in the 20th century. It's not always a rural trade. It's not always old white men that are doing it. There are people of color farming. It often takes place in urban settings. So they're really trying to explore the whole breadth of what farming looks like in Indiana. So they created this podcast. You can go to the Hoosier Young Farmers Coalition website and listen to it. They're also doing some presentations at an upcoming conference at IU. So that was, they were using innovative approaches for a unique topic, and we decided that this was a pretty innovative approach. So they got the $10,000 grant back in 2018. The last big grant that I will talk about, and then we'll spend the last minutes talking about how you actually apply for our grants. The last big grant I'll talk about is the collaboration grant. That offers up to $20,000. As the name suggests, it is for collaborative work. The idea is to support groups that come together to do in-depth humanities programming. And I will say this, the program you propose is important, but just as important is the partnership. For the collaboration grant, we want to see you pairing with at least one other organization where you each are heavily involved in the development of the program, the implementation of the program, where you work together to form a really solid partnership. So, you learn from one another, you grow from one another, and hopefully you continue working together in the future. Now, the partnerships can be within your community. So it could be the public library and the local historical society. It could be across a region. So if there's a group in East Central Indiana that wants to look at the gas boom, and maybe that means it's the Tipton County Historical Society working with the Muncie Public Library to do some touring exhibits and some conversations and some author talks. It could be across the region. It could be across the state. The very first collaboration grant we gave was for a group here in Indianapolis to do, again, some work down in New Harmony, where they were going to do some exhibits that happened both in Indianapolis and New Harmony about New Harmony's history. They're going to do a symposium coming up this April. So that's a case where the partnership was really across the state. This is a grant that requires, again, a 50% match, and just like the innovation grant, we require an inquiry form due on April 30th. And then if we, upon reviewing your idea, feel it's a solid contender for the grant, we will ask you to submit a full application by July 31. Now, I've mentioned a couple of examples already, but I will highlight as our official example for this grant, the Cedar Lake Historical Association. They just put on a program this last summer that was fantastic. Cedar Lake Historical Association is in Northwest Indiana, on a lake, as you can see. Their museum is in an old resort that was on this lake, Cedar Lake, and they wanted to do a history of the resort and help people learn the history of the lake in a unique way. So there's a steam museum a county over in LaPorte County. Cedar Lake is in Lake County, Indiana. The Heston Steam Museum is in LaPorte County. But they worked with the folks at the Steam Museum to bring this old steamboat to the lake. And the steamboat took people out on tours of the lake. They talked about the history of the lake. They talked about how people would arrive to the lake in the summertime via the Monon train. They would take a steamboat just like this across to the resort. So it brought in the history of the community as a resort community, talked about the history of steam and how it revolutionized technology and things like that. This was such a great program. They offered this all week, like 5 days throughout the course of the week. I think like 12 hours worth of tours a day, and they were all sold out. 1,000 people came and did this tour. They did surveys. Most of these people had never been to the museum before. So it was a wonderful way to introduce new people to the museum. They got a bunch of new volunteers by offering such a unique program. And of course, the goal was to form this great partnership with Heston Steam Museum, and they continue to look at ways that they can work together for programs like this in the future. So I think this is a really good role model for what we want the collaboration grant to do. Now, we've highlighted the core grants. I will say that there are some other grants that we offer. I've mentioned already, they're not technically grants, but we do offer programming support, like the authors' talks, the stipends for community reads, things like that. So that's the third bullet. We offer that. If you're not subscribed to Indiana Humanities e-newsletter, you should, because every month we will send out an e-newsletter with all of the different opportunities for both our formal grants or some of our programming support we offer. We do offer from time to time some unique grants. And one of the grants that we offered recently was something called the Advancing Racial Equity Collection Development Grant. That was a $1,000 stipend that folks could, we would give them the funds if they were a library and they wanted to enhance their collection with books about racial injustice and racial equity. We had a preferred list that we developed with the Indianapolis Public Library. They could ask for up to $1,000 to buy copies of books off that list. I do believe that we're going to be offering this again in 2022, so just be on the lookout for that if that interests you. Another grant that we offer is really a fellowship. It's the Wilma Gibbs Moore Fellowship. This is a fellowship that we introduced in late 2020. This is a research grant. So this is the rare case where we are offering funds to individuals. And the idea is that this grant will offer $5,000 to individuals to research topics related to African American history. You apply for the funds, you have to, this is not like our traditional grant where you go through an online portal. You have to send us a prospectus that outlines how you propose to use the funds, the research you're going to do, and things like that. As part of the grant, as part of the fellowship, you will have to do some public programming around it. This is an opportunity that we're going to announce in early February, so keep your eye open for it. It is not really one of our core grants that we offer. It's sort of a special opportunity, but it was really successful when we offered it in 2020, and we're going to do it again in 2022. So look for that. And again, just subscribe to our newsletter so you can always be familiar with what's going on. Okay, so
hey George,
yes,
can I interrupt you for a second to clarify funding publications?
Yes.
There's a question in the chat if you want to look at that one.
Yeah, so we do not generally fund publications. If we funded publications, everybody in the world would come to us with their book ideas and their publishing ideas, and we would be inundated with requests for publications. We don't do that. I think part of the reasoning too is, again, we want to engage people as a community. Book reading in and of itself and book publishing is a solitary event. We don't necessarily want to produce the book. What we want to do is provide you with support so you can take the book and do public programming around it, community-wide reads and conversations. So you will find that we don't publish books. Now, we do from time to time publish brochures, and it's a gray area. And what I would say is if you have a question, let me know. But we will, especially with the Historic Preservation Education Grant, we will publish brochures, walking tours of downtown districts and things like that. So shorter pieces, potentially. We gave a historic preservation education grant this past year to a group up in Angola called the Fox Lake Preservation Association to do a brochure on some of the landmarks on this lake, which was an African-American resort. So that was a brochure we published. But if they had wanted to do a full-size publication on the history of Fox Lake, we would not have done that. The idea is we want something that the public can interact with. We would rather fund the public programs around those. So yeah, I would say that if you have a question about a brochure, reach out to me. As a Xena brochure, let's talk. I would want to know what, if you have an idea to do a zine, let me know. We did provide funds for a publication of a zine to the Lubeznik Art Center up in Michigan City, but it was part of a broader program where they were looking at the history of zines. So they had artists come in, they had public events, they had community conversations, they had panels on the history of zines, and they did actually publish a zine, but it was part of this broader program. So I guess when in all of this, I would really reiterate, we want you to use the humanities to engage people as a community. So anytime you can use something like a zine or a brochure and add context to it in public dialogue and discourse, that's helpful. Okay. We're really out of our time, so I do want to go over a little bit and spend a little bit of time on the application process. If you can stick around, definitely do so. If you have to go, we are recording this. We will provide it on our website, and you can come back and watch the very tail end on our website. But in terms of the application process, you have this idea for a grant. What you're going to do is you're going to go to Indiana Humanities website and you're going to go to the grants page. You will see a section for a page for each of our grants, and you're going to read through. You're going to find the grant that works best for you. You're going to read the guidelines. We have a full set of grant call for proposals, is what we name them. The call for proposals posted. Take a look at those call for proposals. They are very thorough in what we fund and what we don't fund with a grant. Read through those. When you're ready to apply, there's an apply now link that will take you to an online portal that we use. There are some step-by-step instructions included as well, how you go into that portal and navigate it. Basically, if you've not been in the portal before, you've got to create an account with a username and a password. If you've been in the portal before, you've got to log in your email, your password. If you forget the password, let me know, I can reset it for you. But anyway, you do this all online. I will say this, we have 5 different grants. So as you're clicking apply now, make sure that you're going to the grant that you're thinking you're going to. I would say that. Again, read the guidelines. All the requirements, I think all the requirements, most of the requirements are spelled out in the guidelines. Remember, there's 4 guiding principles. You've got to be a tax-exempt organization. It's got to be for a program that's tied to the humanities. You've got to think about your scholars, and you've got to make this program for a school audience. The guidelines do have some restrictions. Basically, you can use grant funds for a lot of things. You can use grant funds to pay for staff time. You can use grant funds to pay for supplies. You can, for fabrication, you can pay stipends. There's really a lot that you can use grant funds for. There are very few restrictions, but there are some restrictions, and these are spelled out in the proposals, each of the call for proposals. I won't read through all of these bullets here, but I'll highlight some of the bigger ones. You cannot use grant funds for any sort of political or religious advocacy. Again, these are taxpayer dollars, so you've got to be neutral in your programming. Now, that is not to say that you cannot do an exhibit on politics. It can be about the history of politics, or it can be comparative religion. What you just can't do is advocate for a particular political standpoint or a particular religion. So you've got to avoid advocacy. Again, we don't provide funding, generally speaking, for operating support, with the rare exception that we might get some pandemic relief funds. All of the funding has to go towards programming. You can't use it for fundraising. Equipment is a big deal. It raises a lot of questions. You can't use, we will not give you a grant to say $3,000 to buy a new scanner for your library. That's out of the question. We're not allowed to do that. No, if you're doing an oral history project and you're going to interview people and you need some recording equipment to actually record and upload these to a website that people can log on to and listen to the histories, we would probably support like the recording equipment if you needed it. So my advice to you is, if you need to make some purchases of equipment as part of your grant proposal, reach out to me and talk to me, and we can kind of look at what that is. You know, if the bulk of the money is going to equipment, it's probably not going to get through. But if an equipment purchase is required to carry out the programming and it's a small part of the grant, we probably can make that happen. One thing that people often try to do is use grant dollars for, like, especially if it's kids programming, for prizes. We cannot do that according to the National Endowment for the Humanities. We cannot support the creation of performance of art. We've talked about that already. If you've got an art related project and you're thinking it borders more into the humanities side of art theory, art criticism, reach out to me and we can talk about that. We cannot provide support for entertainment for the sake of entertainment. So if you're having an event and maybe it's an author talk and you want to hire a jazz band to be in the, the lobby of your building when people come in, just, as they're having hors d'oeuvres, to have some entertainment. We will not support that. Now, if you're doing a story or a program on Indiana history, Indiana's jazz history, and you want to hire a jazz quartet to illustrate some of the different types of jazz in Indiana history, that's fine. That's part of the essential part of the program. So some things that you can't do. If you have questions, again, about any restrictions as you read through the call for proposals, let me know. Know that when you apply for a grant, you are going to have to provide some information, some key information. You're going to have to appoint a project director that's going to be overseeing your grant project. That is the person that we communicate with. Know that you're going, when you apply, go online to the portal, you're going to have to answer a series of narrative questions. We will provide in the call for proposals all of those narrative questions. So when you go online, if you've read the call for proposals, you will know exactly what you need to answer. I would encourage you maybe to type up your answers in a Word document and just paste them into the online portal. Sometimes that works better. It keeps you from losing it for some reason you have an internet disruption or something like that. But all the narrative questions are in the call for proposals. You will need to upload resumes of your project director and the scholars that you have involved. You will also have to upload letters of support for your project. We ask you to collect usually 1 to 2, maybe for some of the larger grants, 2 to 3 letters of support from people in your community. They're saying, this is important to us. This is why I support this project. It is not helpful if it is the organization itself submitting the letter of support. We really want to see support from maybe some of the scholars involved, but definitely from the people in your community that would benefit from it. So this is stuff that you're going to have to work on. You can't just wait to the last minute and expect to, oh, I'm going to go the day before the application is due to load up all of my stuff. It's going to take some preparation. The last thing that you're going to need to load up is the project budget, and let's take a look at that. We do have in the call for proposals a sample budget that you can look at and model your budget on that. We really want you to itemize your expenses. The more detail you provide to your budget, the better. We do not generally fund really broad requests like, oh, I'm going to ask for $3,000 to pay, a speaker to come talk about, whatever topic you're talking. We really want to know, well, okay, who's the speaker? Or it's like, if sometimes people will say, I want $2,500 for supplies, and they don't list, well, what are the supplies? The more specific information you can provide on how you're going to spend your money, the better. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time looking at this budget since especially we're over, but this is what a sort of budget that we have in the call for proposals. This is filled out. When you complete your budget, of course, this is all going to be blank except for this column over here on the left side showing the different categories, and of course the columns up, or the row up at the top. But basically, we want you to put in here on this grid how you're going to spend the grant funds. And you'll see in this example, they put in the program personnel column or row in the grant fund column how they're going to spend the grant dollars for speakers. So it looks like there's $1,000 that they're going to pay for speaker stipends. Down in the next row in the grant funds column, they're going to spend several $100s on mileage and travel, and that's all spelled out. They add up their row, their total request comes to $1,871. You see here we have columns for cash cost share and also in-kind cost share. So in this case, in the cash cost share, they're counting towards the resources they bring to the table, their staff time, as we talked about earlier. They put that in the cash cost share because this is an organization that pays salaries to the people. Cash is being provided to the people to do their work. So, it's cash. Now, in this case, they've also used some volunteers for in-kind. So this is sort of the specificity that we're looking for in the grant budget that you submit.
Hey, George, while you have the budget up, I have 2 kind of related questions here. So if you have a component of the program that is creation of art, or for in one instance, that jazz band example, could you not use our funds for that, but put that towards the match?
Yeah, I would do that for the match. And yeah, so if there's some more artistic components, count that towards your match. And honestly, like in this case, like with the jazz example, if you're bringing like John Edward Hasse in from the Smithsonian, who's a preeminent jazz historian, and you are going to have a jazz band play examples of early Indiana jazz, even though that's performing art, I would also argue that's kind of putting art in the context. So I would probably, if I were a reviewer, I would probably count that as a legitimate grant expense. But if there's any question, you can definitely count it as your own match, and that will be fine. This also raises the point, we in Indiana Humanities, the staff will do the action grant reviews, but generally speaking, all of our reviews are done by outside reviewers. Those often board members and community members. So know that when we're reviewing our grant, there may be some staff members that sit on a review, but a lot of it is done by community members and board members. So it's not us just making the decision. So when I say, you know, if I'm a reviewer, if I were a reviewer, I'd let that probably go in under the grant. That's what I mean. I don't always review the grants, and I'm not definitely the only one reviewing the grants. So anyway, other questions about the budget, Megan?
No, that was it. But can you just clarify eligibility? Can organizations apply for more than one grant?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Because our grant budgets are limited, we have only about a $225,000 pool for grants this year, and we need to get that across the state. We have a policy where if you're an organization, you can get only one of each kind of grant per year. So for example, because we give the action grant out every month, if you're the local historical society and you apply for an action grant in February of 2022 and you get it, we're not going to give you another action grant for the rest of the calendar year. You've got to wait until 2023. But you could apply for and receive a historic preservation education grant if you have another project that you want. So you can get one of each grant, but we're not going to give you more than one of the same grant, if that makes sense. And what we probably won't do is give a different kind of grant for the same project. So if you want to do a walking tour of your downtown historic district and you apply for an HPAG and that helps you pay for the part of the app to do it, but you need more money. And if you apply for an action grant for that very same program, we're probably not going to give you two different grants for the same program, if that makes sense. Okay, wrapping up here. Before we leave the budget, I know we're running out of time, but I will say that if you get a grant from us, keep your budget on hand. We expect you to sort of follow that. Well, we do expect you to follow your proposed budget. If you need to make modifications to it during your grant life cycle, we want you to let us know. At the end, in your final reporting, you will submit a final expenditure report to us that it spells out exactly how you spent the funds. It may look slightly different, but if it looks vastly different, you should have consulted with us. But know that if you get an award, you will send a final expenditure report that looks very similar to this budget that you submitted to us. Okay, before we wrap up, to be successful in your grant application, make sure that it's a humanities-focused project. Make sure that you have specific details about the project, that it's well-defined. We don't like to fund pie-in-the-sky sort of vague ideas. The more detail you can bring about your program, the better. Know who your audience is. Tell us who you're going to serve with this grant. Come to us with a specific timeline. How is this grant going to play out? The guideline, the call for proposals will tell you, but for action grants, we usually like the work to wrap up within a year. For some of the larger grants, the innovation collaboration grants, we say up to 2 years. A big part of the grant proposal process is to articulate the need and the impact. This is competitive. All these grants are competitive. So explain to us how this is going to have an impact on your community and be enthusiastic about it. Again, allow plenty of time to complete the application. Don't wait to the last minute. I would encourage you to have a neutral party read your application before you submit it. Does it make sense to that person? Are there questions that are not answered? If so, adapt it. And then, of course, call us with questions. I'm here to help. Megan is very helpful to grant recipients as well, or grant applicants, I should say. We are glad to spend the time to consult with you so you get your proposal right. And so you're as successful as you possibly can be. And here, finally, I will end with our contact information, my contact information, I should say. You see my email there, my work phone. You can always log into our website, and our grants page is pretty detailed with the information that it provides, but I'm always glad to answer. So any last minute questions, if you want to stick around and drop them in the chat, glad to do that. Megan, you can probably call them out if I have missed some.
Yeah, there is one here. Can you use action grant money to match a collaborative grant?
No, you cannot. And that is a very good point. You cannot use grant dollars to match other grant dollars. And I didn't say this, but this is in the call for proposals. You cannot use other federal dollars, other federal grants for your match. So let's say that you're doing an exhibit and you want to ask $3,000 for an action grant. You cannot use a federal grant that you've received to also pay for your match on that. So that's a sticking point. That's kind of tricky. So if you're going to use our grant dollars for a program, you can't use other federal grant dollars for that program. And I didn't say that in the workshop. That's spelled out in the call for proposals, but that's very important to note. And so you can't use our one grant to match another grant from us either, because that, again, that's basically violating that rule.
Okay, we have another question here. Can money given by another nonprofit be used for match money? That's a yes.
Yes, as long as it's not federal money. So now if the other group is, say, like the Indiana Arts Commission, I would ask them, is this federal money from the National Endowment for the Humanities? I would ask the person the organizations that's providing that money, is this federal money? And if it is, avoid it. But if it's coming from a private foundation or an individual donor or things, that's fine. And one of the things I'll point out, like when you submit your budget, that is an expense-based budget. We simply want to know, how much is it going to cost to put on this program? We don't ask you to document on that budget form where the revenue is coming from. You don't have to provide that to us. We just want to know about the expenses. But yeah, so if your exhibit costs $4,500 on that budget that you submit, we want to see it's going to cost you $4,500. You may ask for $3,000 for us. In the cash share, you will just say we're bringing $1,500 of our own money, but you don't need to say where that's coming from. But know that if it's a federal source, that's a violation of the rules. So don't do that.
All right, I got another one here. Will we fund a continued program in the next year?
By that, I think you mean,
yeah.
Well, there are two ways for me to interpret that. If will we fund the same program in more than 1 year? And if that's what you mean by that, then yes, there are examples of doing that. We often give the Allen County Fort Wayne Historical Society a grant to do its annual speaker series, Sunday speaker series, and they've gotten grants multiple years for that. So if that's what you mean, then yes, we will do that. Again, these are competitive grants, so we kind of look at the big picture. Is this a program that's been going on a lot? Is there a high demand for other organizations to use the funds in different ways? So we won't always continue to support a program if it goes from year after year to year, but sometimes we do. Now, if you mean by continued, will we support a program that spans more than 1 year? Potentially we can do that as well. With the action grant, we like the work to wrap up within a year of the award, and that may span into a couple of years. Some of the larger grants are for multi-year projects. So if you meant it more that way, then for especially the larger grants, yes, we do like fund multi-year projects. Other questions? All right, if there are no other questions, then we'll wrap up this webinar. I apologize for going over about 15 minutes, but I hope it was helpful to you. Know that if you want to ask questions at any time, again, we're accessible. We like to give one-on-one support, so just reach out to us. Contact information is here on the slide. It looks like Megan has put some of her contact information in chat. And know that you can always go to indianahumanities.org, and our staff listing is there, and you can reach out to us that way. So thank you very much for your time today.